Welcome to another ADA compliance Q&A, January 14th, 2025. And thank you so much. Many familiar names that I'm seeing here, and so wonderful to have you on. Happy that I'm able to sign on. I'm here in Los Angeles, Southern California, and at one point we were here in the city I live in, Santa Clarita, surrounded by three fires, and those three were the smaller ones, luckily, and I think they're all out. But of course, there's still a couple really big ones affecting a lot of us. So a pleasure to be here. And where do we begin? As you know, my concept of the five pillars of ADA compliance, and I really think it would be great for us to, and I'll just jump off, and of course you can type in questions or unmute yourself to ask questions, whatever works for you. I did a training in California yesterday with operators and dispatchers and other and management staff. And I think it's so important, the role of compliance oversight. As you know, I'm a huge proponent of having policies. What do policies do? They tell everyone what they need to do in order to be successful and safe and consistent and compliant, right? And so our policies will roll into our training material, and then we train our staff. They go out into service, right? Operators, drivers are delivering service. And then there is the oversight piece. What does it look like, right? What is reasonable? And let me tell you, well, first, of course, these are my thoughts, my opinions based on my 26 years of experience in public transit. So interestingly, the ADA doesn't exactly tell us how to be compliant. There's guidance in the ADA circular, as you know, and there are examples in the ADA circular, but those examples are, you know, they're helpful, but there are so many more scenarios that we experience in service, and so they help us understand a direction, a concept, a philosophy that FTA, the ADA, wants us to consider. And but there are lots of terms that are not defined for us, as I have shared in the past, right? To provide a reasonable level of assistance to people with disabilities. What does reasonable mean? We can deny service if a person is threatening the health and safety of others. What does that threat look like? What does unsafe look like? The term out of the ADA is seriously disruptive. Someone is being seriously disruptive. What does that look like, right? So that's where the policies come in. We get to define all of these things, okay? And when staff is in service, we have the compliance oversight piece, which is such an important element because this is where we are to develop a program. At least my suggestion is, of course, we have a formal program for how we are observing service. Road supervisors, whatever you might call them, other agencies call them transit services managers, lots of terms for staff that are often sent out into service when there is an issue, right? To deal with something in real time. But we should also have an element of our oversight program where we are looking for smoke, as they say. This is a bad pun given the fires here in Southern California, but where there's smoke, there's fire. Um, so that could be, of course, in a complaint. We could consider that to be where there might be some issues, right? Especially if the complaint is determined to be valid, an ADA related complaint. But we have a program. We have a program to observe our operators, to ensure that they're following policy. Honestly, especially in yesterday's training, actually the last several trainings, what I'm finding with the agencies that I'm working with is increased concern over drivers doing more than they are supposed to be, especially in the paratransit environment. Isn't that interesting, right? In ADA paratransit, all of our riders, or at least the primary rider, they may bring companions that are not disabled, but the primary riders, all of them are people with disabilities. And so there is a likely high level of assistance to be provided much more frequently than, say, in fixed route bus service. And so what we're finding is that drivers that are only supposed to go to the door, right? ADA paratransit is origin to destination, door to door. I like the term beyond the curb, but we get to pick. And they're finding that drivers are going door through door, maybe helping people with their groceries into their home. So, on one hand, this is a driver feeling compassion for a person with a disability who says that they need some extra assistance. And in that moment, the driver assists in that way. But that is also increasing liability and accepting some pretty significant um, responsibility, isn't it? And so that's where policies come in. I'm not a fan of a policy that is like up to driver discretion. Let the driver decide. I'm not a big fan of that, mostly because it's really difficult for us to control the consistency and the quality of service when we leave something up to the driver. I think a great example of that might be a package policy. I've worked with agencies that have a package bag policy that says that it is up to the discretion of the driver to assist with packages. And so now we might have some drivers that are assist and are helpful, and then we have other drivers that don't want to touch a bag and provide any assistance at all. And according to policy, both of those things are acceptable, right? But when we talk about quality of service and the usability of the service by people with disabilities, hopefully you'll agree with me that at least there's the possibility for some inconsistent service, and that will drive up your complaints, right? How do we find out about these things that they're an issue? A rider calls to complain to say this driver would not help me with my packages, but the other drivers always do. That's not a valid complaint because of the policy, yet it is a real negative impact on the rider. And so the way we provide oversight of our services, I like, we have a sheet. Our road supervisor is out there. I love some structure where maybe we review every driver once a quarter or twice a year. I'm also a huge fan of prioritizing new drivers and new staff, and maybe we evaluate them 4 times in their first 6 months, 3 times per quarter for the first 2 quarters, whatever that might be. So again, you get to pick and choose what is most effective. And then we also have video. Many systems now have video where you can log in live service and watch what's going on. So that could be a part of your program as well. Lots of ways of achieving this. We have a couple questions, comments here. Let's see. If a client is found using the fixed route service after being approved for paratransit, can their service on paratransit be suspended? And the answer to that is no. We go through eligibility, they provide information, we accept that information, we make a determination, and if it's found that the rider was, I don't know if we want to say the rider was lying or left information out. It could also be a reflection of your eligibility determination process, right? It might not be particularly thorough, especially if perhaps it's a paper process. Maybe we don't get as much information as we want. Do we require a professional verification, maybe a form to be filled out from a doctor? And if we don't get it, do we move on with the eligibility determination without it? So there are lots of elements. That's a great question, actually, because I do have an eligibility determination webinar tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So that would be 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. It's about 3 hours. We have about 10 people signed up, so there is still room to sign up for that. So that would be a great place to have that discussion. But no, uh, the eligibility determination process is an independent process separate from everything else. And so I have heard, and I think I've read in the circular or in one of the other documents on guidance on paratransit eligibility that if we think someone is a good candidate for travel training, maybe we identify them as conditionally eligible, and then they go through travel training, and then maybe we reevaluate. But I don't know of many agencies actually doing that. So here's another question from Rosa. Would it be considered limiting rides if the agency states a minimum stay requirement for ADA paratransit service? I think what you mean here is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like we want them to stay at a destination for a certain period of time before they schedule their return trip. So let's just say they get picked up at 9 a.m. from home and then they want to schedule a return trip at 9:30. But the maybe the trip is a 30-minute trip But then what if we have a 30-minute window? So if we pick the person up on the back end of that 30-minute window and then a 30-minute trip, right? They're not going to get to their destination until almost 10 a.m. and they are going to miss their 9:30 return trip. And so I have seen some policies where maybe they'll say trips cannot be booked more than 30 minutes within each other or 60 minutes within each other. I'm at a loss right now of any language in the ADA or the ADA circular that speaks to that. We just need to make sure, of course, that our services meet the needs of people with disabilities. And so, if anyone would like to chime in on that, do you have a policy that requires people to wait a certain period of time between scheduled trips? That would be very interesting, right? Let's see. Another question here. If a doctor requires a client to have a PCA, can the client be transported without one? And the answer is yes. The ADA is very clear on this issue. In public transit, we cannot require people with disabilities to travel with a personal care attendant. That can be very frustrating because there may be creating some situation, right? Yesterday's training, the example was that a rider was losing their balance a lot and falling, and they needed more assistance than was reasonable. It was more than just, grab my elbow, let me on board. It was like holding their body weight to get them on the vehicle. So what do we do about that? We document the unsafe situation, right? I'm a fan of, and in our society we accept the three strikes and you're out. But if there's something very, very serious and very dangerous, and especially if someone falls and gets injured, and there's no indication that this issue is going to be resolved. So we document that and we contact the rider and or their family members, whoever we need to communicate this with, and let them know that we've identified a seriously disruptive or unsafe situation with their rider, with the rider, how it's impacting the driver, and that services will be suspended until this issue is resolved. And maybe even in our letter, remember, I'm a documentation, so we follow up our conversations on the phone with a letter. We cite the ADA, we cite our policies, and then we state that some solutions include traveling with a personal care attendant, maybe traveling in a manual wheelchair that the driver can push on and on off the vehicle. So we can make suggestions, but we cannot require specific solutions. And so the answer to your question, David, is yes. If the client can be transported without a PCA, no matter what the doctor says, and so that can be frustrating. So again, if there's an issue and they're falling, they're hurting the driver, or some real situation has happened, we document that and then we address it in the way that I described. And what also comes to mind is when we are documenting, uh, we just need to, if we don't document something, it didn't happen, right? And so we want to be really careful about that. So let's talk really quickly. I don't see any of the questions. If anyone would like to unmute themselves, please feel free to ask a question or type another question into chat. Another issue or scenario that has come up in recent trainings has to do with um, the size of wheelchairs, or just whether a wheelchair and or a person with a disability is able to fit on the vehicle. Those of you that have taken my ADA trainings know that it's all about having objective information, right? Facts, observations, not opinion. And so I look at this wheelchair and I say, oh, it's too large to fit on the vehicle. And then I deny services. I would consider that to be a potentially an ADA violation, right? Because we're going by opinion. So how do we know whether a wheelchair can fit through the door, fit on the lift, can go up
Jess,
the ramp? We make our best attempt to give them the opportunity to board as long as it's safe to do that. Yes, question, Rosa?
yes, I have another question,
Uh,
wheelchair related.
yes.
So we had a policy in our rider's guide for CVAN that it just stated keep your wheelchair in good working order, not specifically what that meant,
Right.
but some trainings that I've had recently were really pushing that, there's nothing you can require. And so we were thinking about removing that from our policy, but I felt like it was a good statement to have to
Yeah.
kind of to
No,
show the writers. Yeah.
I agree that that statement seems reasonable to me. Especially given it's a little vague. It's just it's just some guidance to let riders know, really we're talking about safety. Maybe if we add a little something to it to keep wheelchairs in safe operating conditions, something like that, and then leave it like that. You're right about guidance that states that we can't really require a whole lot. An issue that continues to come up in trainings is, oh, we want to have a policy that states um, that every wheelchair has to have footrests. If a wheel is missing on a wheelchair, we can deny service to it. And I don't think that that really works because just because a wheelchair is missing a wheel doesn't necessarily mean that the wheelchair is creating an unsafe situation. So remember, oh, this is really what I wanted to share along these lines. We can't deny service. We can't negatively impact our riders because of an anticipation of an unsafe situation. That's a very high standard. And does that mean we have to wait for someone to fall and get injured before we can do something about it? And the answer is to some extent, yes. Now, if they've fallen and were injured, outside the vehicle trying to board, we can work with that, I would say. We have to be really careful, but we can only deal with issues that exist, right? That's the whole point of using objective information, facts, opinion. I always share in my trainings as well an example where a rider is being pushed out from a facility in their wheelchair, and the facility employee whispers in the driver's ear, "Be careful, they have bed bugs." Is that objective or subjective information for the driver? My answer is it is subjective. It's this other person's opinion. Even if it's this other person's observation in public transit, we need to make that observation. So I can look for bugs, maybe not be so obvious, but I can look around to see if there are any issues. And if I don't see any, I need to proceed in service, right? I need to be able to. Why do I share these opinions? Because I also am an expert witness in lawsuits, and we really, what I find regularly are agencies that don't either have policy or don't have a practice or don't have documentation to support the decisions that they've made, right? And that's why I talk about if we have a policy on it, we train well on it, we have oversight to check on these things. When something happens, we have protection. We can help support our agency and keep it in good standing. And so check this picture out here. This is a really interesting picture, isn't it? I don't know if you can tell, but it is a power wheelchair that has either had the seat replaced with, or there is like a dining chair on top of the wheelchair base. And I know there's a comment here. It looks that there are some safety related concerns. We have to remember that the definition of a wheelchair, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, is three or more wheels designed, modified, used by people with mobility impairments, right? And so this wheelchair has been modified. And so if we're able to secure the base of the wheelchair, then we have a policy where we attach the lap and shoulder belt. Of course, in fixed route bus, we offer lap and shoulder belt, right? I'm not really sure what we can do here. So it's definitely been modified, and the base is a wheelchair. So, I tend to fall on the side of the rider in protecting their rights. Why? Because I feel like the ADA does that in an overwhelming manner. That's why there are so many choices that people with disabilities have when using public transit services. They get to choose the direction they board a vehicle. They get to choose whether they have the lap and shoulder belt on fixed route buses, right? Because the buses don't have seat belts on all the seats. They get to choose whether they power their wheelchair on and off if they're on a lift. So there are all these choices, and we could also agree that by not choosing to have these things done, it makes their ride potentially less safe. We call that equity. And so, yeah. Here's a question, a little follow-up. If the driver does observe bed bugs, can we refuse service? And the answer is yes. Now, again, those of you that have taken my trainings, you know this is where the real work starts, right? As soon as we decide we are going to deny services to someone, this is the real work. Now we need to document it. I am also a huge fan, as you know, of requiring that any denial of service be approved by a dispatcher and supervisor manager, whatever your structure is. That we don't let drivers deny the boarding, especially of people with disabilities, without first receiving approval. What can that look like? The driver observes bed bugs, contacts dispatch. Maybe you have a code. Maybe they're able to communicate, without sharing this information publicly. I have a rider here. I have observed bed bugs. I would like to deny services, requesting approval to deny services. And then maybe the dispatcher says, please describe or please provide observations or what you have observed. The driver does that, and then dispatch can approve that date, timestamp, write a note of what they saw, and then just to dot the I and cross the T at the end of the day, I would say that, or their shift, the driver should complete a miscellaneous report so that it is noted. And then I would even, because we're talking about a denial of service for a person with a disability, I'd even pull the audio and video if your vehicles have it. And this is how we protect our agency, protect the driver, and we are able to defend, if we ever need to, the decision that we've made, right? And so I hope that's helpful to you, Nancy, in following up on issues of bed bugs. And so, we look at this picture here, and yes, there are bags. Could these bags impact the ability of the driver to secure the wheelchair? Definitely could. Um, so that's where great training comes in, right? Great ongoing wheelchair securement training. And I do also travel the country doing hands-on wheelchair securement trainings. Usually what it looks like is maybe in the morning we do classroom ADA compliance training, review all of the operating requirements of the ADA, and then in the afternoon we work on vehicles in small groups. And we go through wheelchair securement training, and I observe and I do a little worksheet on every driver and provide some guidance and just get them to practice hands-on. You wouldn't believe how many agencies have a training program that does not include either initial wheelchair securement training, they just make them watch a video, or if they do, they don't have ongoing wheelchair securement training. And remember, one of the standards in the ADA, let me pull it back up. One of the standards in the ADA is that we train staff to proficiency. We train them to be experts in their job, right? There's also a comment in there that says that it is expected that once we train staff to be proficient, that they will forever retain their knowledge and abilities to safely assist people with disabilities. So there is no excuse, and especially in a lawsuit, like if I'm retained to represent a family of a person that was badly injured due to what they believe was driver neglect, right? I'm going to be asking for policies and training material and interviewing the trainer and interviewing the driver. And we're going to do all these things. And in every case, when I've done this, we have found inconsistencies. And so we want to be very careful. Training doesn't end when your training program is done and they've completed it and they've gone into service. It doesn't. Quite frankly, we should consider every employee to be in the constant state of training, right? I think if we think of it that way, we can incorporate ongoing elements. That's how I think about myself, quite frankly. Okay, ADA guru. Do I know everything about the ADA? I don't know that I know everything. I know a lot. I try to share what I know with all of you, right? But I am always in the state of learning and understanding. So here's a question. How would you handle the situation? The passenger uses a wheelchair to go to dialysis, on a DR route. What is DR? The only issue is where the unit has to park to pick up and drop off because it has to reverse onto the street in order to get out of the area. We already talked to the clinic and are unwilling to move on, and they are unwilling to move onto the safer side. Okay, so we're talking about a safety issue regarding the vehicle. I have seen created many policies where uh, we state something like vehicles are only allowed onto you know, public property and private property where access is allowed to the public, and will not be taken into dark areas, will not put the vehicle in harm's way, will not service an area that requires the vehicle to back up. That is not an unreasonable policy to have. And um, so yes, I would say if you wanted to have a policy that does not allow vehicles to reverse, the larger the vehicle, the more unsafe that is, right? Maybe we can agree backing up a minivan, maybe that's not the end of the world, but a cutaway, a large cutaway, let alone a fixed route bus. And so maybe that's Dollaride, right? On a Dollaride route. So this is a cutaway, maybe a minivan. And so, yes, we could have a policy where we state we do not back up. Now, but let's take it one step further. Uh, how is this going to impact the rider, right? Does that mean the rider will not have transportation? And so, yes, you can have the policy on one hand. On the other hand, I would continue to talk with the facility to see if we can come up with some other situation. Is there somewhere else that they can be dropped off? Can you provide an accommodation? Is this reasonable for you? Um, Marcos, is this reasonable for your agency, your drivers, to park in a safer location and to provide an accommodation to maybe push them or walk them to the facility door or to meet halfway with the facility, whatever that might be? So, I'm a huge fan of trying to figure out how to um, assist people with disabilities, right? Because remember, when something changes, when a mistake is made, when there is some issue, who is who is the group that is most negatively impacted every single time? People with disabilities. So remember that, right? In this example, perfect example. We have an issue. Yes, it makes sense. We don't want vehicles to back up. But now, who's going to suffer the most? That rider. And what can we do about that? A quick request to see about the pillars. Here are the 5 pillars of ADA compliance: the built environment. We need to have accessible vehicles, facilities. Pillar 2, policies and procedures. 3, training staff to proficiency. 4, compliance oversight. And 5, rider education. I'll probably do this in a couple weeks again. I'll be traveling next week, but I think maybe I'll talk about rider education next time. Last question. I'm sorry that I need to sign out here. Oh, this is from my good friend Juan in California. Thoughts on having Uber Transit as a pilot program to provide late night trips when buses are not in service? I know they don't have wheelchair vans. Yeah, those of you that I've had conversations with about Uber, Lyft, etc. The heartburn that I have is the fact that they do not provide equivalent, anywhere near equivalent service for people with disabilities using wheelchairs. And so I've seen arrangements where they contract wheelchair securement, wheelchair trips out to vendors, but an Uber is going to show up within 5 minutes to my house, sometimes 2 minutes, and it might take 30, 40, 60, 90 minutes for a wheelchair accessible van to show up. That is not equity, but it's a pilot project, so maybe there's opportunity to work on this issue to get some good contractors to provide wheelchair accessible trips. Maybe what I would recommend before the pilot starts is to try to do some type of survey, Juan, of the community to see how much demand is there for these late night hours and to ask if people have any particular issues, like they use a wheelchair, travel with a service animal, just to collect data to see potentially how many people and therefore maybe how many trips we might be talking about here. So those are some of the things that come to mind. So happy to help with you, Juan, there, and say hi to everyone in Manteca. All right, everyone, that is our time. Again, there is an ADA paratransit eligibility determination webinar tomorrow. It's at 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So you can go to adaguru.co and then go to workshops and you can register. And then I think in a couple weeks, there's also my general ADA compliance requirements class. If you haven't taken any webinars, trainings with me, that is a great place to start. And then, of course, Hawaii, right? I'm this close to finalizing all the details for an ADA compliance symposium. It's going to be a 3-day training in Hawaii. And so keep an eye out for that in the next day or two. I'll be sending out emails and we'll start registration this week as well. Okay. So always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, your attention, your questions. Always consider me a resource. You can email me at info@adaguru.co, and I try to respond within a few days to your questions, comments, and again, always available for trainings, even on your site, helping agencies with policies and procedures, riders manuals, especially for ADA paratransit and Dollar Ride, lots of different ways that I am able to assist. So please consider me your ADA compliance expert. Okay? Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe, especially those of you in Southern California here with me. Have a wonderful day. Talk to you soon.